right, boy, it's a scorcher here today. We are definitely in the summer months here in Pittsburgh. In fact, yesterday was the solstice. That's right. Is that right? Yesterday. So yesterday was the longest day, or does that mean today is the longest day? I think yesterday was the earliest sunrise, the latest sunset. So from here on out, it's straight towards the heat death of the universe. Today, let's see. Today I want to ask the question why Messiaen, in his Techniques of Musical Language, refers to 7 modes. Why there are 7, why they are those 7. Are there others? The answer is yes, there are others. So what was it about the characteristics of the modes that Messiaen talks about in chapter 15 and onwards of Techniques of My Musical Language that makes them particularly interesting to Messiaen? So think of this as another introductory video as I defer and delay my deep dive into each of the modes. Last time I talked about Maurice Emmanuel and his study of the Burgundian folk songs, which I felt laid out a model for how Messiaen thought about modes. Maybe not the specific modes, but the idea that you could write a book organized around modes with musical examples. Emmanuel was a professor at the conservatoire and would have taught Messiaen. He was a professor of musicology. And those songs are ordered around what we call the church modes. And there are 8 of the church modes. And then we have the major and minor scales that we are very familiar with in the Western musical tradition. And there are 12 of those. So what are they? And I think the first thing, we need to establish a framework for what we mean by a mode and a scale. And there's all kinds of textbooks that will tell you the correct distinction between those. Here's what I've got, and that's all I have. So all I can offer is my take on this stuff. I think of a scale as a sequence of intervals that may or may not have interesting, more or less compelling attributes of symmetry or of patterning involved in the description of the scale. That sequence of intervals can be transposed. We're particularly interested in chromatic transposition, the half-step transposition, because one of the attributes, as we look ahead to why Messiaen is interested in some modes and not others, some scales have the attribute of limited transposition, meaning you have fewer half-step transpositions available than you have steps in the scale before you start to repeat the same pitch set. We'll give some examples of what that means, but think of it as a scale could have 8 pitches in it. If you were to transpose it 8 times, you could have 8 different pitch sets, maybe overlapping but different. Or it might be a scale constructed in such a way that after you've gone up a whole step or a whole and a half step, you're back playing the same pitches that you began with. So you have a scale, there's a sequence of intervals, and then we have the concept of transposition. Then a mode is, within the scale, the sequence of intervals that you arrive at if you play all of the notes within the scale starting on different steps within the scale. For example, the C major scale. We all know this, the white notes on the piano. The C major scale. Transpose it up a half step. You have a major scale, but it's the C sharp major scale. And there are only two equivalent notes, and those are actually on harmonic spellings. You have the E sharp and the B sharp, which is the enharmonic equivalent of the F and the C in the C major scale. Then C major, start on the second degree of the scale. And we have one of the church modes. So those are the three. We're going to go through all of this in more detail, but those are the three definitional attributes of scales and modes that I think we need to consider here. And I think part of the problem is the Messiaen is using mode when I think he might mean scale. We'll manage. Now, having said that, let's look at that in a bit more detail, because ultimately we want to say why Messiaen says there are only 7 modes that he's interested in. The major scale is a sequence of intervals symmetrically arranged around a whole step in the middle. So we have a whole step, and a half step, and then up a whole step, and then we have the same pattern again, whole step, half step. These 4 notes are called a tetrachord, and the C major scale has 2 symmetrical tetrachords split around a whole step in the middle. So the major scale is whole, half, whole, half. And you can start on any of the chromatic pitches within the equal tempered, equally divided octave. And I probably should have started off with that. Is that everything that I'm talking about here today, about modes and about scales, applies to the well-tempered scales as seen on the piano keyboard and as used in Messiaen's music. Right? There are, of course, many other ways of breaking up a scale, many other ways of defining modes, many other uses of modes. Messiaen uses modes for harmony and melody. Modes can also include requirements around rhythm, very broad definitions of modes around feeling and mood. We are going to defer that discussion and focus today exclusively on the modes that arrive from the equal division of the octave into 12 parts. Probably should have started with that, but those of you who have already commented about my blinkered Western mindset, you are absolutely right to do so. Thank you for commenting. Go ahead and subscribe. I will promise to infuriate you more and more frequently as we talk about these things. So, that's the major scale. And I already said that you can transpose that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times before you arrive back at the exact same pitch sets. You can start on any of the chromatic divisions, the 12 equal divisions of the octave, and you will have a major scale. It's probably all noisy. The major scale, then if you were to start on the second degree of the major scale, which in this case is a D, this exercise of playing all of the white notes of the piano is how most of us learned our hypomixolydian modes and what have you. Beginning on D, conveniently is called Dorian, And you can see, as you would expect, that the difference between the major scale, which is the Ionian mode, and the Dorian mode is the position of the half step in the pattern. So whole, half, whole, and then a whole, half, whole, and that's your and you can hear it sounds already to our ears medieval. I play a lot of hurdy-gurdy music that's in Dorian. The Dorian mode can be played and can begin on any of the other degrees of the scale. You could start the Dorian mode on an E. You could start it on F sharp. Same thing, right? The transposition rules hold the same. Each of the modes have the same number of transpositions. They are not limited in their transposition. And you can see how, if you're writing in a tradition or a culture that values the ability to move between harmonic centers, different keys, right, associated with the scales, with a scale that has sort of a built-in a built-in tendency to resolve and to lead, then the ability to move between keys of nearer and further relationship is powerful. It's the ability to modulate to the dominant, to modulate to the keys on the third. All of the movements that we're familiar with in terms of harmony are possible and effective because of the scalar relationships of the Ionian mode. But if you're not interested in that, what if you're interested in harmony that is non-functional but still structured? I mean, let's look at a different mode now, a mode that is not, or that does have limited transposition. The whole tone scale, which is the first mode that Messiaen writes about, but the mode that he uses the least, and he uses it the least, he says in the book and in interviews, because Debussy used the whole tone scale to extraordinary effect. And I think maybe Messiaen either felt like he didn't need to write any more or didn't want the hassle of competing. So the whole tone scale, as it sounds like, is every pitch in the scale is a whole tone separate from the previous. So if we start on C, we go to D, then to E. Up a whole step from E is F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and then a whole step back up. Now you're back up to C. What happens if you transpose it and start on C sharp, E sharp, bow. So that's fine. You have different pitch sets. But if you transpose it another half step up and start on the D, you have the same pitches within the scale that you had when you started on C. So it has one transposition. It is limited. It's a mode of limited transposition. Very characteristic sound for Messiaen, rather for Debussy. Another mode that Messiaen documents is the second mode, which is the Octatonic scale, which if you read your music history books, you'll see associated with Stravinsky, and then a lot of the other sort of writers in that neoclassic phase. And the Octatonic scale is alternating the whole step with the half step. So you start on C to D to E flat, right? And then up a whole step to to F, up a half step, F sharp, whole step, G sharp, then A. This mode also limited transposition. Right. Now, Messiaen is interested in modes of limited transposition. We've talked a lot about this in earlier videos because his motivation, or his technique, his compositional filter, compositional prism, as he calls it, is to create kind of a sense of harmonic stasis, where the change within the harmony is tightly constrained and points towards this sort of umbilical cord of the intersection of harmony and rhythm. So we've talked a lot about non-retrogradable rhythms that have a limited capability to, on their own, mutate. Those patterns then can be extended, abbreviated in other ways, in the same way that the modes can be extended and enhanced through the addition of additional pitches and additional relationships. But at its core, you have an object, a musical object that is tightly defined. And this is the charm of impossibility that Messiaen refers to. The impossibility also, and I think in this sense you can think of as constraint or limited resources, focus, and in that focus you're pointing to where he wants the music to go to. Now, Messiaen, of course, didn't invent any of these scales. Oh, and in fact, what I should have started with at the beginning is my personal theory is that Messiaen didn't sit down and learn about the different modes and then say, I'm going to compose in those modes. I think he was a composer. He let his fingers, right? And then his magical compositional craft was to be able to remember what he did there. Write it down, and then perhaps when necessary correct it or not, and recognize that his fingers were seeking out these patterns. And the patterns are these groups of related intervals, whole steps and half steps. And so the scales that he's interested in are scales that have repeated units of whole steps and half steps. And the math behind this is complicated. And I'm going to include a link to a couple of YouTube videos and Reddit subreddits where mathematicians talk about this stuff. Because you can arrange the 12 steps of the scale of the octave into 4,096 patterns. Reading that, I'm going to assume that's true. I would have thought it was more, but I'll take it as read. And then you could sort of brute force your way through all of those and figure out which patterns meet certain requirements. Or you could look at this picture, and this is fantastic, right? I'm going to try to summarize the thinking that this guy put into it. But definitely go and check out this thread because it's really great. The 12 equal parts of the octave can be divided into the factors of 12 are 2, 3, 4, and 6. So you can find patterns that have repeated 2 notes, six groups of 2, 4 groups of 3, 3 groups of 4, or 2 groups of 6. And within that, then you can see the arrangements of on and off that give you these patterns. And then Messiaen is not interested in patterns that have steps greater than the whole step. And so he's not interested in creating modes that are harmony with thirds may be implied in some of the modes, but that isn't his defining characteristic. He's looking for arrangements of half steps and whole steps. And so then that gets you to your 7 modes. Perfect. Now, we're going to go through the modes. Next episode, next video, I'm going to bring the book out, and then we're going to dig into what Messiaen says. But I'd wanted to psych myself up for that by doing a couple of these preparatory videos. And here's what I'm thinking right now. Back what I said about the fingers. Each of the modes has a characteristic, available set of melodic devices or characteristics that Messiaen will take advantage of. But I'm absolutely convinced that the theoretical abbreviation or the theoretical alignment to a mode came after the fact, and that Messiaen, primarily an improviser, arrived at harmonies whatever that was, and then wrote them down, and then studied and referred, and sort of had this self-referential loop where he realized that these modes were interesting from a physiological sense, right? Physiological. That's the key here. The modes are a useful way of defining the physiology of the music. And as we move through the language that he uses to describe his techniques, I think that will hold out to be true. But the only way to find out whether I'm being entirely speculative and a bit of a bullshitter is to stick with me on this. And if you made it this far, thank you very much. And as always, keep your wits about you. And I will talk to you again in a couple of weeks or so.